today I'm going to talk like back when I was here last 4 years ago about not really about my company, but more the stuff that motivates me to do the work that I do. And specifically, I'm going to basically over the next 15 or 20 minutes give 3 arguments. The first one is about becoming an obligatory passage point. I'm going to introduce some sociology here. It's where my background is, and what it is essentially the outcome of a successful technology. When a technology is successful, it becomes an obligatory passage point in sociological language. The second argument is about the how of being successful. I'll introduce this idea of translations. Again, if there are people who are intimately familiar with actor network theory, a kind of obscure branch of sociology, you'll know what I'm talking about. I think this is a useful concept for specifically understanding what social services do when they're doing their job and evaluating what is good design. And then lastly, if we have time, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think motivates an entrepreneur, and specifically about what motivates me right now, where I see the next opportunity. So I was indeed the first speaker of the first Mobile Monday about 4 years ago. And when I came in and saw this space, I realized that although it's not the same space, and I know that those of you who are following this on the live stream probably can't appreciate where we are, but we're in a beautiful old church. And indeed, the first Mobile Monday took place in a church, although not this one. And that reminded me that as I was talking about and introducing this concept of microblogging that I think a lot of people nowadays are familiar with through things like Twitter, tweeting, status updates on things like Facebook, but which definitely was not familiar 4 years ago to, I think, most of the audience. And this idea of social objects that I'll talk a little bit about here today as well. The last slide is something that I wanted to share with you today. The last slide of my talk was like this, and it was actually produced by an advertising agency, not me, as a proposal that was in fact rejected by me. But it was interesting enough that I don't really know, but for some reason I put this at the very end of that talk, and I was reminded of that by the fact that we're now in a church. And the thing that struck me about it was, and that inspired me to do this talk was, at the time, the reason I rejected it was because although I kind of shared this idea and conviction that at some point it was likely that celebrities such as even the Pope might post haikus, or tweet, you might say nowadays, it seemed quite audacious, and a lot of people reacted to it in a very disbelief was basically what mostly it got back as a reaction. However, just recently I came across an article in a UK newspaper about the Pope now embracing social media, and in fact he's got not only, I believe, Twitter presence and Facebook presence, but also his own YouTube channel and his very own iPhone app. So some predictions appear to have come true. Now, the question here is, what happened? And now I'd like to introduce this idea from sociology. What we see happening is microblogging over the 4 years since we last met here at Mobile Amsterdam. Those of you who were at the first one will remember, it was kind of an obscure thing that most people thought geeks would do over their trios and their sidekicks. But now it's something that everybody sort of takes as the normal practice. And in fact, you kind of have to tweet or you have to be on Facebook in order to have a presence on the internet nowadays, it seems. And the way to kind of break this down is here's here's another guy who actually works with Michel Collin called Bruno Latour, who explains how something, a technology, an innovation, a company, kind of emerges from obscurity and becomes an obligatory passage point. If you have a chance, read his book, The Pasteurization of France, where Latour talks about how this process of pasteurization and this really an early entrepreneur, Pasteur himself, kind of turned that into such a commonplace practice nowadays that you really can't go into a town or even a village in France without encountering some rude pasteur somewhere on the map. And these translations there's a stepwise process through which an entrepreneur will start by sort of assembling a problem and then engaging others into what's called a network. In fact, the whole theory kind of gets its name from this network, this idea that ends up functioning when we have a technology that's represented by a company that's run by an entrepreneur is an actor network. It can function as a singular unit, or it can be broken down into kind of like a distributed network of pieces, depending on how you look at it. And the interesting part about it that is it is both material as well as symbolic. So there's concepts that are interlinked and networked that work together, in addition to material technology that works together. And now, why is this relevant? Well, because I think social media is also about translations. The way these translations function is, if you think about the simple effect of capturing a photo in a digital form on maybe on your iPhone or your Android, you're sort of taking this event and you're capturing and translating it into a digital object. And now this is what I call a social object. Once it's shared online, and once people discover a way to network and connect through and around it, that's when I call that a social object. And this is what you see in a tweet, for instance, now, if you think about microblogging. And nowadays, in addition to being an entrepreneur, I also help other entrepreneurs. I advise and sometimes even do modest investments in other startups. And I've noticed that what seems to work and what's a good practice for kind of trying to figure out which companies and which startups are interesting is to think about, well, who has a potentially new social object that they're introducing? Flickr, kind of was arguably the first service to do this in a big way to photos, turn photos into social objects. YouTube did this to videos. Early service like Delicious was successful at doing this to bookmarks. And so you think about, well, who would be doing it for places now? And you see Dodgeball sort of evolving into Foursquare and doing that now. Something like creating an event. And this is a process which, interestingly, again, looking at a little bit of the psychological side of it, why is this something that people do so much? Why are we addicted to Facebook and Twitter? And one of the concepts that I like to look at when I'm thinking about this is to contrast, the effect you have when you open up Facebook with the effect you have, especially if you're working in a big corporation, when you open up email. And a friend of mine, Linda Stone, I think coined a beautiful phrase, which you may have heard, called email apnea. Apnea is the disorder that you may have heard of when you're sleeping that causes you to experience problems breathing. And it turns out when you look at people who are opening up their email, typically it's their work email, you'll kind of hold your breath when you wait for Gmail to load because you're sort of expecting bad news. It's work that you have to respond to. That's the kind of effect of email apnea. And if you contrast that with recent research on social streams, live streams I used to call them, things like Twitter, Facebook, early things like Jaiku, something of an exact opposite effect is happening, where it turns out these streams trigger a hormone called oxytocin in your brain, which those of you who know about brain chemistry will recognize as one of the hormones that it's a feel-good hormone. It's the same hormone that gets transmitted when you're feeling great, when you're having an intimate encounter with someone, for instance. And this is really interesting because what I think is happening, if you think about it, is you don't have the necessity to respond to tweets or to Facebook newsfeed posts the same way that you kind of have an expectation to respond to your emails. And not only is this addictive on the receiving side when you get these little oxytocin kicks, but also on the creator side. How many here still have a blog? Just curious, like, are there blogs? Wow, oh my God, a lot of people here. Well, keep your hands up. How many of you are on Twitter or Facebook? Okay, that's pretty much 100% of the audience. Now, please keep your hands up and tell me how many of you have ever experienced or thought to yourselves, gosh, well, I really should be blogging more, or maybe I should be tweeting a little bit more, that you're not doing it enough. Anybody out there? Most people are still keeping your hands up. Thank you. Well, this is a sociologist called Karin Knorr-Chetna, who I use a lot when I think about social objects, who's kind of made an interesting, I think it's a little bit of a psychoanalytical argument that when you post a blog post, when you post a photo on Flickr, when you post a video on YouTube, whatever it is, these are all serial formats. You think about things like Tumblr, WordPress blogs, tweets, they're streams, they're serials. And whenever you update, it already within it sort of implies that the next update is missing. And you kind of feel like you have to keep updating all the time. And it's beautifully built into this sense of lacking. As soon as you've delivered something, you already feel like you need to be delivering the next one. And obviously, part of the reason why all of this is prevailing, why we have kind of expanded this, the Dunbar number of, connections, meaningful connections to 150 people to the point where now I think the average number of friends people have on Facebook is above and beyond that, and it's not uncommon for people to have thousands of friends on these social networking services, is because really the power of the internet, the story of the internet is largely a story of zero transaction costs and what you can do with that when you involve people in human communication, which means you can just basically talk to a whole lot more people at once. And somebody who I think is kind of a controversial figure in a funny way, and someone I really enjoy reading, Guy Kawasaki. One of his phrases that I really like myself when I'm thinking about the motivation behind all of this, how do we harness this power of zero transaction costs? It's this idea that you really should be creating something that not only makes money, but ideally would also make meaning, have sense, have a purpose, a sense of purpose. And he asks you, well, as an entrepreneur, what's your mantra? And for me, the answer is, well, I'm interested in helping the internet, or harnessing the power of the internet, harnessing this amazing distribution network that we have at our disposal for connecting people, like we saw that image from space of the Earth. You could imagine the internet kind of allowing us that same, not in such a visual form, but that ability to connect and bind together people. And really, for me, it's about helping people help each other as an entrepreneur. And there's, again, another sociological concept that I urge you to investigate if you're into this stuff. Probably one of my favorite concepts of all time, called legitimate peripheral participation, by a wonderful researcher and Berkeley professor called Jean Lave. And Jean talks about what she means with this idea of LPP, legitimate peripheral participation, is really in learning and apprenticeship, where the best type of learning happens in situations where it's possible for the novices to take part in something peripherally, participate, just observe, be there, be present. Maybe if you have children, you'll recognize this. You're in the kitchen, you're preparing food, and maybe your daughter or your son is there, and they're present, they're participating. It's legitimate for them to be there. And slowly they apprentice and become masters at cooking or whatever. And I think this is one of the key strengths, the key promises of social services, is that we can now expand this. We can participate legitimately and peripherally in things like uprisings in the Middle East, or even in some more personal conversations that are happening across the globe. And now, when you think about the way these conversations are structured nowadays, I think the sort of first generation of Web 2.0 user-generated services epitomized nowadays, I think, in the heyday, we're living the heyday of one of them, namely Facebook, is that these services tend to be designed and optimized around enabling you in beautiful ways to share events after they've occurred, sort of post facto. Essentially, what you're doing is you're sharing the past. They're about the past. And then right now we're seeing kind of a new generation of sort of mainly mobile. There's this concept of the real-time web. What we're talking about here in case of things like Foursquare that I'm sure everyone here is aware of is kind of pushing the boundary and really sharing something that's happening now in the present. Things like Foursquare are about the present. You can check in to Mobile Monday Amsterdam and see who else is there now. Now, Matt Jones, a former colleague of mine from Nokia and a friend, wrote something that I think makes a lot of sense. It's a beautiful blog post where, to kind of gel it in a tweet form, he said, he still maintains that it's not really the exactly here, the exactly now that is as interesting as sharing what's about to happen next, the here-ish, the soonish, the there-ish, the then-ish, as he said it. And for me, there's right now not a single service that has sort of captured that space of the near future, the same way that, I don't know, a Facebook may have captured sharing of the past, or a Foursquare, the sharing of the present. And I wonder, as an entrepreneur, as someone who's trying to create, could intent be translated into a social object? And I look at things like calendars, event services that are out there, and I think, well, none of these are really built around what my former PhD supervisor, Lucy Suchman, talks about in her book, Situated Actions, where she kind of takes apart this idea of traditional artificial intelligence. It's a very influential book in the field of interaction design. Those of you who are operating in this domain will probably recognize this book, where basically people don't really make plans. People are much more ad hoc. They're situated. And it occurs to me, as here's just an example from, actually this is a screenshot from Ditto, the app that I'm working on right now, of today. This morning I said I'm heading out for breakfast, and someone else responds with a completely ad hoc suggestion that doesn't have anything to do with breakfast, but somehow involves Amsterdam. And I end up discovering, that there's, an art installation that I probably should be going to see during my visit here before I leave tomorrow. And this is kind of what I mean, and this is what I'm interested in, is, discovery in a broad sense, I think, is going social, and social is going mobile. So having the ability to build UIs that enable us in this way to kind of have these meaningful social interactions with a little bit of structure that makes it possible to optimize them for a touch UI. I think one of the key innovations of Foursquare was to figure out a way, as we're going into smaller and smaller segments, from blogging to microblogging to now just check-ins, to do stuff by just touching. This is one of the reasons why I think Fred Wilson is right, that mobile will disrupt services that were built fundamentally for the web. His example here is Facebook. I think it applies to also things like Yelp. And that we're kind of going into a phase where tapping is greater than typing. There's more tapping happening than there is typing. And kind of how do we build these social gestures that are simple taps, yet somehow meaningful, and disrupt the existing incumbents to kind of, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but build something that's simpler than Facebook, more fun than Twitter, and more useful than Foursquare. I think for anybody out there in the audience or who's watching this, on the live stream, if you're building a social app, you're going to have to disrupt the incumbents, and those are the incumbents right now. And you can do that because structured data is now available. And I won't go into this in detail, but if you look at somebody like John Battelle, I think there's great posts out there about how we can build human contact into this kind of structured interactions that are gestures without necessarily requiring a lot of work from people. And I think that's possible because not only do we have ways of doing tap UIs and combining structured data through APIs, things like Spotify, even Foursquare, Facebook. You can pull location data. You can pull movie data out of things like IMDb. And we have real-time push notifications, which we didn't have at the time. We had things like Jaiku, where we had to pay for SMS, which almost killed us as a company because those costs were so high. And we can now do that for free with things like the Apple Push Notification Framework. So I'll just run quickly through an example of how it works. You can just share something such as I'm heading out to see a movie without ever having to type anything, get a response, and end up, in this case, it's a real case example where I ended up actually changing my mind because somebody said, oh, don't go see that. That's not a great movie. I just saw it last night. And then someone else recommends another movie that I end up seeing that was actually great. So sometimes you may even think that you've decided to go someplace and then only realize by the act of sharing that out that you should reverse your decision and do something else. And this is what I mean by creating experiences that end up, being win, because you didn't have to spend much time, and whoever responded to you had to spend even less time, and ended up in a big way, sort of affecting you in a positive way. So I'll just kind of close and summarize here because I'm out of time with my 5 takeaways. If you know this concept of the social object, you know that you need to define it when you're building a service, but that's not enough. You also need to be able to design those translations, such as, if you're building for a mobile UI, optimize for tapping, optimize for not typing, but for ways of enabling those gestures, those translations like the photo taking, that intent, turning that intent into a social object by just tapping, and then enabling legitimate peripheral participation through things like, in the case of Ditto, trying to do that through enabling people to respond with these things like a little thanks icon. And then, if you're successful, become an obligatory passage point, but don't do it for the money, do it because you're making meaning. All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks.